Very warm welcome to all of you. I hope you're all keeping warm as we're in the midst of winter now. I want to welcome you all to the webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is hosted at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Christy Miller-Hesed. I'm the Actionable Science Lead at the center, and co-hosting this webinar with me is my colleague Haley Robe. So we bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the north central United States that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. And before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. You'll see we are recording this webinar, and you can find all of our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the question and answer period at the end. However, if you do have questions, we encourage you to put those in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the question and answer period. And we'll try to answer those in the order they're received. We're going to end the formal part of this webinar right at noon Mountain Time, and we'll stop the recording at that point. But if anyone wishes to stay on to engage in a more informal conversation with our speaker, you're encouraged to do so. Now I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today, who is Robin Hextrum. Robin is an award-winning contemporary painter who lives and works in Denver. She grew up in a small coastal town in Northern California, where she developed a passion for the natural environment that continues to inform her paintings. During her undergrad studies at USC, she completed a double major in fine art and neuroscience and studied with renowned artists including Ruth Weisberg and Ron Ritzk. She also received her Master of Fine Arts in Painting from Laguna College of Art and Design, where she worked with some of the top representational painters in the country. Following her MFA, Robin completed a second master's degree in art history at UC Riverside. And her paintings represent a fusion of her traditional art training and her knowledge of art history. Robin is currently a tenured professor and chair of the visual art program at Regis University. She's exhibited her paintings internationally and is the recipient of prestigious grants from the Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation and the Stobart Foundation. Art critic Ray Mark Rinaldi notes that Hextrum's work, quote, manages to be romantic and mathematical all at once. And Robin has gallery representation at Aubin Gallery in Denver. The title of her presentation today is Dreams from the Anthropocene. And I'll let you take it away from here, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'm very honored to be here. And thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I greatly appreciate that. So, as Christy mentioned, the title for this talk is Dreams from the Anthropocene. A lot of my work is rooted in concerns around the environment, or how we're treating, plants, animals, creatures, environmental systems, and what power we have as humans over that. I will say it is humbling to be speaking as an artist in front of so many scientific experts in this field. And I think I'm probably not bringing any new scientific knowledge to you through this talk, but what I'm hoping that I convey to you is some sense of, that kind of deep human grappling with the existential threat of climate change, and how can we process this threat through art and think through these issues, share awareness about these issues, and kind of, work through some of these really difficult, concepts and feelings. So I think a lot of my work is about that very processing of, how do we handle these really overwhelming thoughts and this overwhelming sense of what's happening with our climate. So the first painting I wanted to share is from some time ago. I did this in 2012 during my MFA program, where I focused a lot on contemporary seascapes. A lot of my work dealt with painting water, painting natural environments. And this painting is titled Left Behind. At first, when people look at this painting, they often just see a reflection and maybe the sun reflecting on the water. But if you look a little closer, you can also see the shape of a submerged bicycle. So you can see, multiple layers in here. There's the sky, a tree, the surface of the water, and the bike submerged under the water. And this was one of a series I was doing that was interested in having objects submerged in water, floating in water. And it started getting me thinking about floodscapes, thinking about capturing some of these natural disasters that we were seeing around us. So around this time, in 2011, this was a major year of flooding along the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio rivers. And I made this painting titled Swept Away, where I went on Craigslist and got this child's toy and went in, a river near my house and put it floating in the river. And it was actually really funny when I was taking the reference for this because there was a father with his child, like, what is this crazy person doing trying to get this photo reference? But this painting in particular was about, me trying to process this huge year of news reports and journalistic photography of different floods. And I wanted to build a narrative. So you can see I have a child's toy floating in the water in this floodscape. So there's this implication of, where is the child? Is the child safe, right? There's these kind of somber narratives you can pull out of this. And this painting is also a really good example of how sometimes something personal can relate to something larger and global that's going on. So at the time, I was also processing my parents' divorce and really re-examining my own childhood. So there was something really cathartic about making a painting that was casting this shadow over that. And at the same time, it was speaking to just these really epic series of floods that I was seeing on the news over and over and over again. The next painting I want to share is a similar idea. So this is another floodscape I did, and you can see it's in dimension quite a bit smaller. I did quite a few of these paintings on a really small scale that are really intricate, lots of tiny brushes and right up close. And these paintings, you can see it's very still and very calm on the water surface. So in this painting, I wanted to capture the aftermath of a natural disaster, the aftermath of flooding, with this very calm, still, kind of tranquil moment that happens. I think sometimes when we're thinking about, chaos, the tendency can be to portray the peak of the conflict or the peak of, kind of the excitement and, chaos around what's happening or the climax of something. And something I started to get more interested in was the aftermath of these disasters and, what that aftermath would look like. So this one, like the previous painting, also has that kind of somber message of, where is the child that had this toy? What happened? Why are they separated? What are we seeing here as we're looking at this? And this is another piece in this series. Again, you can see it's, very intricate. So this one's only 6 by 12 inches. And I did a playground slide and a reflection and this, long horizon. And you can see these works also have this kind of dreamlike, surreal quality to them. I would say a lot of my work takes emphasis from surrealism. And, as I'm working on my paintings, I'm also listening to a number of audiobooks to keep my attention. So, one of the audiobooks I was listening to was The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. And that really got me thinking about, natural disaster and extinction and, how we're impacting the climate. Another book that really resonated with me recently is The Overstory by Richard Powers, that was looking at this narrative around protecting forests. So, having my brain activated by reading a lot of authors engaging in climate science and activism will also inform how I'm thinking. And in this series, I'm capturing this very quiet, calm moment. This piece in particular is inspired by where I originally grew up in Davis, California, before my family moved to Stinson. We lived across the street from a sod farm, and you could see these silos in the distance across this really flat space. So I just imagine, what would that look like if that memory I have from a child of looking out on this expansive field was just a flood of water. So I think a lot of these works, again, are me kind of processing and imagining and, thinking through the impacts of these natural disasters that are ever increasing in intensity and frequency because of climate change. In this painting, I'm adding, living, breathing animal or horse walking through here. So again, it's something that you'll see in a lot of my paintings. I think that there's something, beautiful and a little bit tragic and also a little bit of a mystery. I've never been really big on wanting to have something very clear in its narrative and really illustrative. I like to have something that's, leaving some space for the viewer to bring some of their interpretation to it and their experience and their feeling. So I find myself in my process and in my paintings really drawn to somewhat ambiguous narratives. And I also find that that can lend itself to, processing this existential threat of climate change, because we're constantly dealing with like contradictions, ambiguity, this kind of confusing set of different circumstances with this. This is another painting that I did. Again, a lot of these are inspired by journalistic photography. And, this is the kind of scene we continue to see in news coverage of floods, where it's, the cars just constantly submerged in water. We have a very car-centric society. And this one in particular, both a vehicle and someone's home that's submerged, right? So in terms of the narrative, it's implying, again, that sense of loss and that sense of displacement through what's happening with a natural disaster. This one is of an actual donut shop that I used to live by when I was living in Long Beach. And I thought, this would be interesting, having like a retail space or a location that's distributing something, and also something that's, in my environment that I'm passing by every day, and just imagining this kind of disaster in my own environment. And this is the last one I'm showing from this series. I showed these or painted these two statues in this flood scenario. And to me, this is really getting at us as humans understanding the potential for our own extinction. So you see the statues are, missing hands and heads. There's already this destruction to the statues. And it's feeling like, the aftermath of something. So I think that's something that I'm always processing myself, but something I'm also interested in my work is, how do we as humans grapple with the fact that the actions we're doing to sustain ourselves are the very actions that could be our undoing? And, how do we grapple with that contradiction and with those really conflicting incentives that we have in our day-to-day lived experience? Okay, so you can see a big switch up here. So you'll see throughout as I'm showing these different works, they could almost be different artists. And that's because I've really liked to push myself and try really different ways of handling different series, and giving myself that creative freedom to not feel too tied to a particular aesthetic or a particular way of approaching a problem. So around 2016, we had a very contentious and to many of us nerve-wracking election. And at the time, I was really feeling this level of anxiety kicking in. And I started to feel like these really calm paintings I had been doing while I was, happy with what they had accomplished. I started to feel like, I need to do something that has this level of urgency or intensity that I'm feeling in the political, social, and environmental tensions around me right now. So this painting is called Red Storm, and I did this realistic portrait of a horse rearing in the middle of this, red, kind of chaotic environment with some silhouettes, some lines, some things kind of disintegrating. So here I'm also playing with dimensions. So I'm playing with like some three-dimensional elements, two-dimensional elements, one-dimensional linear elements. But you can see overall like space itself is kind of getting fractured. So there's a vulnerability for the horse in this environment in terms of like this just does not feel like a stable environment or that things can really be sustained in this environment. And the red to me too calls to that sense of like, warming temperatures or temperatures rising, creating something that feels unsustainable. I think this painting has this kind of whimsical approach to it at first, and then when you kind of sit with what's happening, it's like, oh, okay, that's actually like, there's a deeper critique happening here. So I did this, realistic portrait of this polar bear in this kind of abstracted tropical environment. So you're seeing a, cold habitat animal in this tropical environment. There's this contradiction there of, how is this animal, living and sustaining itself within the context of this environment. So again, at first approach, it feels like, oh, okay, this is kind of happy and fun. And then as you're sitting with it, there's something a little bit darker to process. If anyone watched the TV series Lost, you could also make the connection between the polar bear on the island. Sometimes I can't help, I think, but some TV show or something you're watching can kind of work its way into your ideas when you're painting something. But this is, again, me kind of thinking about these contradictions with climate change. How is it that, we're having all kinds of species, including humans, being asked to now live in really different environments from what they had initially developed and adapted to. This is probably one of my more literal pieces. I think a lot of my pieces are arriving at this, kind of through the back door, through another way of entering. And this one I did in 2019 after the California wildfires. So during that time, there were 7,860 fires across the state of California, and 259,823 acres were burned. One of those fires came within about 50 feet of my mom's house in Southern California at the time she was living near San Diego. And having it come so close to, you know, destroying my mom's home, potentially killing my mom even, um, it really hit home for me quite literally, right? These natural disasters are impacting all of us, and whether they're directly impacting us, they're directly impacting people we love and care about and know. And during those fires as well, it was just really sad what was happening to the wildlife. All these stories that were coming out about, dead and burned wildlife and forests. And so I wanted to do a painting showing animals in that, really fiery environment, trying to escape it. Um, so I think this is my, kind of homage to those animals who are dying in these fires. And, it gets this like, homage to the innocent, right? Because they are the innocent caught up in these greater forces that they are not having control over. Now we're seeing again another shift in my work. So after I had explored, I think, different forms of resolution, different techniques, and kind of, playing around with these different strategies, I started to hone in on a new theme that was combining imagery from traditional Dutch still lives with icebergs. And this started to be really interesting to me for a number of reasons. So, first and foremost, the title of the talk has the word Anthropocene in it. So we're in a geological era known as the Anthropocene. And as many of you know, right, this is a period referring to the significant human impact that we're having on species extinction and the climate. We've created our own epoch through our actions. Now, what's interesting to me about thinking about the origins of that is they're so much farther than just thinking about the recent few decades or even the early 20th century, by showing these really opulent flowers from Dutch still lifes, I'm calling back to that Dutch golden age. That's one of these origins of trade, colonialism, market capitalism, consumption, right? All of these things that have been with us for, many centuries, and we're trying to grapple with the impacts of them now. So when you look at these really opulent Dutch paintings, you'll see that they're um, showing, many different flowers from different periods or from different seasons and locations, exotic fruits from different countries, even coral or shells, right? So there's a level of wealth that comes across in these Dutch flower paintings and this very idealized beauty. So I thought this would be so interesting to have these oversized flowers growing in a climate they shouldn't be growing in, and then also having that historical legacy that they're calling back to that Dutch golden age. So here's an example of, the still life that I'm pulling from to make my painting. So I'll, literally copy different flowers from these pieces and rearrange them and recompose them onto icebergs to fit my composition or my narrative. In this particular painting, you can see it also has a Vanitas theme. So a Vanitas or Memento Mori painting is a reference to contemplating our mortality. And this is really subtle. So the more obvious Vanitas paintings you're probably familiar with are the paintings of like a skull and an hourglass and a wilting flower, right? So it's like we only get to live so long. This one's really subtle. So you can see it in the watch. There's a gold watch, so that's represents time. And then having like flies, flowers kind of aging in different states, this really subtle reference to our brief time here. Now, this kind of, subtle Vanitas work that's, rooted in the Dutch still life floral tradition, that cautionary tale is we have this brief time, so you have to be really religious and stop doing fun things that are, too much fun and not enough about God, right? To really focus on that. My interpretation of that Vanitas cautionary tale is kind of different. It's not about, don't have fun. It's more about, what is our overall time as humans, right? So I'm seeing my work as kind of working in that tradition and thinking about, the cautionary tale being like, what is our brevity of time on the planet just as a species? So, rooting myself within this tradition, but not from a religious perspective, but thinking about it in terms of, what kind of ticking clock do we have with the climate? So this is another example of that, juxtaposing these Dutch still life items with these icebergs. And the title of this one is called Still Life for a Human Epoch. So you can see, these really beautiful, elaborate flowers, and also these, beautifully crafted gold items and like a nautilus shell piece, right? So having these, really beautiful symbols of kind of wealth and prosperity, oversized and overblown, inhabiting this, frozen space, right? And again, a lot of my work, I'm interested in building that contradiction. So it's forcing the viewer to come in and sit with that, and sit with how to process these kinds of contradictions. This is another painting, so that's dealing with this theme, and it's called, Tulips with Glacier. Um, you'll see a lot of these tulips with stripes and striations in traditional Dutch paintings. These particular tulips were really rare and sought after. And, during the Dutch Golden Age, there was a speculative bubble called tulip mania, where tulip bulbs just ran wild. Everyone went crazy for them, so they could sell as much as a house, right? So a really rare tulip bulb could be the equivalent of a house, which is just nuts to think of. But, in our own lifetimes, we've lived through many a speculative bubble and like, many ways we kind of fall for that same trap over and over again. So again, when I'm painting this particular kind of tulip that's referencing that period in, the Dutch economy and in our history, and then pulling it to our conception of climate change today, there's a lot of things I'm going after with that in this kind of work. This is another example of, again, showing, that beautiful kind of striped tulip and then these, luxurious items sitting in this glacial environment. And again, calling to this legacy of need for material wealth, opulism, etc. And then how are we processing those implications for our own climate? So this is not my painting. This is a painting by a surrealist artist named Dorothea Tanning. And I wanted to share her work with you because you can see a lot of my work has a surreal quality to it. And everyone knows Salvador Dali and the melting clocks, but a lot of people don't realize there's a ton of really phenomenal female surrealist artists out there. And, Frida Kahlo among them, although she's complicated because she doesn't self-identify as a surrealist, so we kind of put her in that. But in any case, Dorothea Tanning, a wonderful surrealist painter, and I thought this painting would be applicable because she, quite literally has a flower in there. And what you can see with the surrealist painters is they're collaging and combining different elements. They're also playing with scale. And the goal is to get at a sense of, a dreamlike state or the unconscious. This painting in particular is probably more on the scale of like, happy dream to nightmare. This one's a little more nightmarish the longer you look at it. And the title is ironic in that sense. It's called A Little Night Music. Um, but I wanted to share this surrealist piece because, those artists have influenced me quite a bit. And there's ways that I'm working within that legacy, but then also doing something a little bit different from what they were doing. So the surrealist artists were working within, Freudian theories of the subconscious and trying to visually represent those through their collage by collaging these, elements that really were incongruous and didn't make sense being next to each other. Whereas what I am doing is, taking these different elements and collaging them together to build that narrative around the impacts of climate change and how we're processing climate change. So again, you can see there's these surrealist devices in here, right, of playing with scale, collaging different elements, creating something that feels dreamlike. And for surrealists, that was kind of the end in itself, was to create that dreamlike environment. Whereas I think I'm pulling these surrealist strategies and then using them in my own work to build this awareness. So this is, I think, a good example of that, and this one's titled Anthropocene Still Life. So, again, this, traditional still life scene that you might see, um, that in some ways looks, perfectly in place, and yet this scene just should not exist, both in scale and in the combination of the different elements that we're seeing juxtaposed together. This painting is called Indian Rhino on Ice. And I recognize it's kind of the opposite of the other painting that I did, right? That was the polar bear in a tropical environment. Here I'm having an Indian rhino that should be in a warm environment, and I'm putting this animal literally on ice, right? So I think what happens a lot when in global warming is there's the hurricane or really cold weather that will come through, and people will say, hey, there's no such thing as global warming, right? It got cold. And from the little that I've gathered, it's more complicated than that, right? That it's we have these extreme temperature fluctuations. We'll have extreme heat and extreme cold. So we have these really extreme kind of contradictions we're having to navigate. So I wanted to do a painting that was playing with that sense of contradiction, not always in that direction we're thinking, where it's like, okay, global warming equals hot all the time, thinking, global warming equals really unpredictable weather patterns that are causing these very surprising situations for us to navigate as humans. And then we're also seeing animals and plants in their natural environment encountering that. So a very extreme example, right? But I'm kind of trying to get at the extreme to get us to think about what we're confronting every day, and what we're processing. This is another painting that I made where I'm collaging icebergs, and rather than pulling from a traditional Dutch still life, I copied in the foreground a scene from a painting by an artist named Frederick Church called The Heart of the Andes, and it's 1859. So I thought this would be really fascinating to combine, showing this large glacier, and then, the scene of it kind of melting into a waterfall, and this really, lush environment in the foreground. This painting I'm referencing as well is from a series of, American landscape painters, and that history is a little bit fraught now because it's so rooted in colonialism. And for that very reason, I find that interesting to work with that imagery and combine it with comments on global warming, because where we are today is also rooted in colonization and the aftermath of that. So I think whenever I'm making a painting, there's a lot of different layers I like to work with. And I like to make the work in itself that it's going to be intriguing and beautiful and resonate with you, regardless if you're picking up on all of those references. But there are these other layers and references in there if you are interested in, or are familiar with them, to pull out when you're looking at some of these paintings. So this was the image used to promote the event, and that I had on the first slide. It's called Resting Place. And this one, I think it has all of those elements that were in the other pieces in terms of referencing the Dutch Golden Age and Dutch still life legacy. And I painted the bird from a hunting still life. So this is a pretty popular genre as well. You see just like lots of, dead birds as a sign of like wealth and, prosperity. And here I'm taking that paint legacy in painting and recontextualizing it. And it creates this sense of almost a memorial, or a feeling like a memorial to the dead bird. So I think in this painting, I wanted to pull in all of those references I've been discussing so far. But I think it also has this kind of more literal feeling of memorializing animals who are suffering in this process. And I also wanted to make it a little ambiguous in terms of, it could look like the flowers are like growing out of the bird. There's a little bit of ambiguity there in this painting as well. This is another painting that I made a little bit more recently. So this was in 2023. And this one I wanted to do a visual metaphor for, it's something I'm guilty of. I think we're all guilty of all the time, is, how do we respond to this chaos, right? We get hit with these really overwhelming stories. There's this really dramatic, series of events unfolding around us, and often our response is to kind of go inward and shut down. So I painted this statue of the female figure in the center where her eyes are closed. She's, quite literally turning away her head. And then I pulled these different animals from different hunting paintings. There's a whole bunch of paintings that are like, let's paint, dogs chasing down deer, right? Or let's paint animals tearing at each other's throats. So I found these series of paintings and I combined them together to create this really violent, chaotic scene around this figure. And the statue and the trees, they're pulled from a French tradition known as Rococo. That's a very kind of luxurious, opulent tradition. And then there's this very violent foreground with all these animals going after each other. So again, I don't see myself as, above this necessarily. This is something I feel I'm doing, right? Where it's just, you get hit with this overwhelming news and it's like, I don't even know what to do. Like, what do I do? And, it's like, how do we call ourselves to action or call ourselves to that better action rather than turning inwards? How can we, at least, begin to open our eyes to what's happening and then think about how do we take action to that. So this is the last painting I'll share with you. That's from a recent solo exhibition I had at a Bend gallery called Animal Kingdom. For this series, I did paintings of animals taking over museum and gallery spaces and kind of reclaiming the world from humans. So this series was kind of a little bit more playful in some ways, and I had a lot of fun working on it. And this painting in particular, I found really interesting to work on. So I did a portrait of a buffalo in the foreground. And behind that buffalo, you can see a painting. And this painting is called American Progress by John Gast. So you can see this, central figure is, quite literally representing manifest destiny. And you can see there's kind of this painted narrative of like light to dark. So you have American colonists coming in, laying down railways, putting in power lines, building an infrastructure, and quite literally, chasing away Buffalo and Indigenous Americans in the process. So this painting is really fascinating to me because when it was painted, it was considered this very legitimate narrative and this very much like, yes, this is what needs to happen. Like, and this is just good that we're, making room for more of this kind of way of life. And I thought, what if a buffalo could actually share their, curatorial feedback about this, right? What's a buffalo's perspective on this? Because just as we know about the really horrifying, decimation of the, human indigenous population, there's also this like just catastrophic decimation of the buffalo population, particularly by the introduction of guns. So, the buffalo's response is they just literally beat up the painting in the gallery. It's just like, I don't like it, And, again, in the legacy of portraiture, this is like a portrait of an animal, giving an animal that autonomy and giving the animal the ability to say, like, I too am not comfortable with this narrative or what's happening here. So I think with this painting, it's not necessarily as direct in terms of a climate change critique, but I think it's getting at a lot of issues that are, adjacent and overlapping with that around, how are we thinking about who controls the narrative, who has agency, who has the ability to speak, and then how are we thinking outside the box in terms of, honoring different ideas and solutions to that. Well, thank you, everyone. That concludes my part of the talk, and I'm very eager to hear any questions, comments, ideas, anything and everything anyone can throw at me.
No, thank you so much, Robin. Really, really enjoyed that. So refreshing to have a different way to think about climate change and our role in it. And I see we already have a question. At this point, if I would encourage folks, if you're comfortable with it, to go ahead and turn on your camera so we can see each other. And when you want to ask a question, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself. So, Scott, I see your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Well, Robin, I'm out in the middle of the Pacific, extremely remote, rural island, Hawaii Island, and I just want to say mahalo nui, um, profound, just stunning sharing. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm getting attacked by my own bird dog. Speaking of hunting, but down. But I spent a lot of time around polar bears, the gray wolf, um, black bears, brown bears, certainly bison, and this is digs deep into me. And more recently, though, as a climate adaptation scientist for decades, or more of a facilitator, I'm interested in if you. I've got 1,000 questions, but I'm going to stick to maybe one, not the most important either. But I would just love to hear your interactions with universities. I've had a lot of, I would say, challenge recently. I'm trying. It's kind of a twofold question. Is first trying to get published artistic images in STEM journals is very hard. That's something I've experienced more recently. And then second, in doing that, kind of honoring artists such that they can maintain copyrights within universities. They're more typically sort of um, disseminating knowledge, we'll say, disseminating data, and not in the business of handing over copyrights to artists. And I've really had some great success in doing that, allowing both funding and supporting artists to do their work in the science arena, and then hopefully one day, I mean, I'm not banking on this getting it published in not a STEM journal as it turns out, but more likely humanities, etc. And I can get into that later. But I just wonder your interactions with universities, if you've had any experience in this notion of, say, a lot of STEM journals talk about storytelling, and they're really focused on data, not the stories. And I'm kind of the reverse. And so I've had a hard time there. And I wonder if your experience in journals in general, what that might have been, and or folks you know, and then also this notion of maintaining artists' control over their work in a university setting.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And thanks for your kind words about my work too. It's really, again, an honor to be able to share my work with all of you who are, directly doing the good fight to, help us make change and get to a better place on all of this. So I really appreciate that. That means quite a bit. Um, I haven't had quite that much experience with what you're referring to, and mainly that is because my position as an academic is as a creative researcher. So often my colleagues don't understand what that even looks like. They're kind of like, well, what does that mean? You don't publish in journals? Like, what is that? So, as an art professor, my research is counted in terms of, actually making the work and then exhibiting the work. So my form of publication is, in some sense, the exhibit. So far for me, that's been, exhibiting in, galleries, college art spaces, etc. Um, my older sister, she's a really wonderful academic and researcher at Oregon State and does really amazing work about racial privilege in college athletics. And she and I have a lot of conversations about how it's different for each of us. So, and sometimes she's envious of me as an artist because, like, I physically make something, I can quote unquote publish it in an art space. I can send it out to an exhibition, but that exhibition space doesn't own it. I retain the copyright to my work. Whereas she's complaining to me of like, oh, when I publish something in a journal article, it's like that article owns that work, right? And they can hold it up through a series of revisions, And for me, there's right, there's a lot of freedom in the sense that I'm able to make something on my own without anyone saying I can or can't do it. And then in a sense, it almost feels self-published, but it's do it through the authority of like a gallery or another art space. That's the filter, is like whether or not they're actually willing to let you show. But you have quite a bit of freedom in terms of like how you show, and then you're retaining the copyright. So I think it is really interesting for like a visual artwork, because even if my visual artwork, I've had my work on book covers before, right? So there's like maybe there's a small payment for that. Um, but in that sense, I'm not handing over the, like, they're paying for the rights to it, but I still maintain the primary copyright to it. So in our conversations, it's really interesting because I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. Like, it does make me appreciate being on the kind of creative scholarship side. That said, I have been in some pretty aggravating meetings with colleagues where they just like so fundamentally don't understand that like what I do as a form of research or a form of work, that I'm having to like really break it down of like, no, this is like hard and it takes a lot of time and it took a lot of education to get here, right? But I appreciate that question.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And reach out to me anytime. Maybe folks on here might know how to reach me, but really appreciate it. It sort of endorses that this is sort of the front end of moving outside of silos. And I will say, as a hunter, in very different realms than you presented in these art forms, I'm just blown away by the power of your art. I just thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I should say too, often I'm vegan and I'm very pro animal rights, and I think sometimes people who our hunters will get nervous around me, and I'm like, no, I mean, you have the that's vast majority of time, I think people who are engaged in if they're, doing it in a sustainable way, there's also a lot of concern about not causing harm to the animal, so it's just one bad day. And where my veganism is rooted and is often in the deep concern around factory farming and the industrial scale of, large scale animal torture that we see to have these kind of disassociated piles of meat in our grocery stores and whatnot. So yeah, I always find it interesting to meet people who are engaged in that, because I think there's not always the conflict you might think there. Oh yeah, thank
Exactly.
you.
And often deep connection to place and land in a spiritual sense. And outside of, I couldn't agree more with what you just said as far as that. I mean, yes. So I'll be quiet. Thanks so much. Aloha.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that great question and answer as well. Sarah Johnson had put in the chat question: do you teach introductory workshops to inspire folks to weave climate change into their art? And if I might add on to that, do you ever teach climate change folks how to weave art into their work?
That is, I think, such a great concept and idea. And I think I'm just going to make a note of that because I would love to do that at some point. So I haven't done either of those things, but I think that would be a really interesting idea to tackle. Um, I've been just quite busy with the demands of my own academic position and making paintings and exhibiting primarily through my gallery at Bend in downtown Denver, and finding the time to handle my own teaching responsibilities can be quite a bit. So it's always, I think, if there is a limitation there, it's often on just finding the time. But that's a really great idea that I'm going to make a note of, because I think that would be really interesting.
I can follow up with an email to you. I have a specific idea in mind.
Oh, great. Thank you.
The next question that came through in the chat, it was from Dominique. I'm going to say the last name wrong, but it looks like Bachelet, perhaps. She says, great painting representing the 2016 situation. Do you have a painting in the works inspired by current situation in regards to elections 2024 and climate change denial?
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh. Um, I think probably like many of the people on this call, I was pretty devastated by the results of the 2024 election. I think how that is going to work into my art is going to take some time because I have a series that you can see that I've started around me. So I'm in my studio right now, and I have a number of paintings that I've already begun for an exhibition that's going to be in September in 2025 at a Bend Gallery. And a lot of the paintings I'm working on right now, I think they're trying to get at a sense of, magic and wonder and joy in the natural environment. So I'm working a lot with mythological creatures and fantasy and combining different, animals together and juxtaposing that with real creatures that are also quite strange to look at to reignite just our wonder in the environment around us. So, the series I've been working on now has been, I would say, like a more positive and hopeful angle to try to inspire joy, curiosity, wonder in the national environment and seeing, how do I get at this issue from that angle. But so I'm in this point where I'm, having to follow through and finish all of these things, which anyone who's working on a longer term project, that's always the hardest part. It's so fun to start things and you're like, okay, now I have to finish them all. Um, so I'm, feeling committed to, following this series out, but I can't help but think that both the, just the psychological impact of the election we had and what is likely coming in this upcoming year, I think as an artist, you can't help but have that influence what you're doing. I think just that influence in this case, is going to take some more processing and finishing the current series I'm working on. A term I've always really liked to think about for artists is they're osmotically philosophical. So that term like osmosis, right? That artists are, like all of us, we're here, we're absorbing all of these things and they're coming out in our work in different ways. So yeah, I anticipate it will be coming out in my work and I'm not sure how, but I think I don't think most of us are going to escape a lot of the kind of feelings and needing to kind of process what's about to hit us.
Yeah, and your response, I think, segues nicely into the next question, which was from Sophie Christel. She says, your work is stunning and so deeply emotional. How do you maintain hope and positivity when you work all the time with such heavy material?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's like kind of cathartic. So if you think about, you go through a breakup, you don't necessarily want to listen to like really happy songs. You want to listen to like Alanis Morissette and just like whatever can like really get you like, like, so I think there's a lot of feelings of catharsis if I'm making a painting that's, kind of dark or sad. It's an opportunity for me to have this like really therapeutic moment to like work through those feelings. That being said, I think there's a certain point where I'll work on a series, particularly like I can go back to the beginning series, right? These gray floodscapes. I, painted them and I was making them for a while and I also lived with them, so I hung up like quite a few in my bedroom. And then at a certain point, I was like, "This is just kind of sad. I think I need to change the change the series that I'm looking at every night." So I think there is, there's a sense of catharsis in the process of making the work. But I do think after a certain point of really working on a series, I'll be ready to approach it in a different way. And then I have noticed, the series I'm working on now, that's allowing me to enter into more kind of magical, fantastical spaces. That is also its own kind of angle and therapy and rejuvenating kind of thing. But I do think I'm really a painter's painter. I think some people consider themselves, I'm an artist who happens to paint, but I think for me, like painting is just it's like in my blood. It's so connected to me that just the process of painting gives me so much and I get back from it so much that even if I'm working on something pretty dark, there's something that's happening in that process that's really a benefit to me as well.
And we have one last question, and then we'll formally wrap up. But if anyone wants to stick around for a few minutes, feel free to do so. The last question is from Marta Kim. She says, Robin, incredible work. Have you collaborated with other organizations or entities to help move viewers from awareness to action, from depression to agency and empowerment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something I would like to do more of. This actually came up in the last time I had a solo exhibition. I was doing quite a bit of work about, using American landscapes. So that was the painting. I think this is at the more towards the end, where I'm taking these American landscapes and, putting them in a new context and kind of reconfiguring them. And if you look at the history of like the American landscape tradition, um, there's a way that that tradition was used as almost like a form of propaganda to justify colonization. And I was bringing this up in my talk, and someone came up to me and they're like, "Okay, that's really interesting. What you need to do is like, good propaganda with your art and figure out how to kind of flip that. So rather than like, this like colonialist propaganda, it's like how do you get your art to be like, really functioning that way?" So I think my main avenue has been through trying to share my work as much as I can, exhibit it, not just in my gallery, but in other, public spaces. And I think I'm still searching for ways that I can find that kind of collaboration. And I'm always open to ideas and open to new things. So, for example, even just being able to give this talk today is really meaningful to be able to collaborate that way. Um, the main form of collaboration I've done recently was collaboration with a really phenomenal colleague of mine named Elise Knorr, who's an amazing poet. And she and I did some collaborations with my paintings and her poetry. So I think collaboration can be a really interesting way of cross-pollinating and kind of getting that excitement again. But I am also, I think, keenly aware of, yeah, how do you shift from that contemplative space to action, right? And how can that relationship be there between, people like myself as artists and makers and people who are, making that change and making that action. So, I've participated in events like, there was an auction for the Humane League that was really meaningful to me because my art was able to be like auctioned and sold for that. And I do personally donate some of the funds from my painting profits to the Humane League and to the Rainforest Trust. That's an organization that buys up sections of the rainforest to protect and prevent from destruction. But yeah, so it's something I think I want to do more on and investigate more because I do feel um, there's a lot more room for that in my practice.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. Really appreciated not only seeing your just phenomenal art, but as many have noted in the comments, is just so moving and thought provoking. But also for sharing your sort of the thinking that went into all of that art. I'm gonna stop the recording now.